Hey guys, video 13.2, and I just clicked start on my timer, and we're 2 seconds in, and of course my computer's not loading. Alright, so the Great War begins. Armies on the march. Austria-Hungary is being aggressive towards Serbia. You can see that down here with everything that's gone on with Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So now Russia starts marching its troops to the borders of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia and quickly attacks France. Alright? They go right through. Great Britain declares war on Germany. Alright? So that's kind of what started the war. Russians marching, and from there we go. Alright? Nations take side. So very quickly, by mid-August 1940, two sides are at war throughout Europe. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, even Bulgaria and others. Get it? Central Powers, they're kind of right down the middle. Alright, the other allies, you've got Britain, you've got France, you've got Russia, you've got Italy. Notice the United States not till 1917. Here again, Central Powers, Britain, France, Russia. Alright? Another one, you could make a list on who's on whose side. Spain is neutral. Portugal is going to go with the Allies. Morocco, Algeria. Green is with the Allies. This pinkish tannis is, again, either central. CC Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary. Sarajevo is important because that is where Franz Ferdinand got shot. The yellow are neutral countries. Okay. Notice the further you are from the fighting, except for Switzerland and Netherlands, you're able to stay neutral. Notice here it shows Belgium as being green. Belgium is really yellow until Germany goes marching through it. Alright? In fact, let me point something out in a minute. Here you see this area is called the Western Front. North, South, West, East. So if that's the Western Front, you'll also hear about the Eastern Front. The war becomes a bloody stalemate, partly because of the von Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan basically was this plan to march right from Germany, right through Belgium. That's the key, through Belgium to Paris. Alright? And what happens at this key battle, the first battle of the Marne, the Germans are turned back. So here's Paris. The Germans cut through Belgium to get there. The French are able to stop them, so the von Schlieffen Plan fails. Hashtag fails because of the Battle of the Marne. The von Schlieffen Plan, again, instead of attacking down here where the French might have their troops lined up, the Germans decide we're going to sneak through Belgium, and notice if they sneak through Belgium, they can get to Paris very quickly. Germany developed this battle plan: defeat France on the west first, then crush Russia to the east. They felt like Russia's poor railway system would make it easy to beat the Russians because they'd have a hard time getting supplies, and the army that eats the least loses the fastest. What's interesting is most Europeans thought the war was going to be quick. Kaiser Wilhelm tells his troops you'll be home before the leaves have fallen from the trees. That is inaccurate. Very quickly, once the war begins, a British officer writes to Churchill and says it's going to be a long war, in spite of the fact that on both sides, every single man in it wants it stopped at once. And we'll talk about in a minute why the war becomes so bloody and so nasty. So again, the von Schlieffen Plan. Here's Germany. The red lines represent German. The blue kind of bubbles are areas that have been fortified. Notice along the Belgian border there's very little fortification. So the idea is that they can march right into Paris and take it. But at the Battle of the Marne, it's the first major battle. We see French versus German. They needed every available soldier to fight, but transports were slow, so the French actually used about 600 taxi cabs to rush soldiers from Paris to the front lines. And because the Germans couldn't get into Paris, which is the capital of France, the von Schlieffen Plan was stopped, which then thereby guaranteed this is a slow, brutal, grueling, slow war. Alright, and the effect of the Battle of the Marne, it essentially destroyed the Schlieffen Plan. And if the Schlieffen Plan, the von Schlieffen Plan, doesn't work, it means we're going to have this long and bloody war. So you're going to hear two areas of the war. The Western Front we just talked about, that's primarily Germany versus France. We'll also see the British, because here's the British involved. All right, so just understand that. Western Front, again, on the west side. All right, and it becomes, again, Western Front. The black little area here are German forces, the red are the Allied forces. And it becomes a war in the trenches. It's a heavy battle zone in northern France, and basically what both sides started to do were dig these deep trenches, which we'll talk a lot about in a while. We'll talk about why it was so disgusting. And what happens is, remember, the last unit was the Industrial Revolution, which meant that there were all these new inventions. Well, these new weapons led only to more death. And one of the two battles we'll spend a lot of time talking about are the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme, they basically turned a forest into a swamp. There was so much explosion, so much shooting, so much death, that they took one of the world's most beautiful forests and turned it into a swamp. The Western Front is like a Reuben. The German sauerkraut goes up against the French dressing, and it's just not as good as you think it would be. That's the goofy picture of this video. Okay, so if you have a Western Front, you're going to have an Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is basically going to be fighting along the German-Russian border. Again, here's Europe, Western, Eastern. All right. Russians push into Austria and Germany, but soon forced to retreat. The Russians have some problems. They have a ton of guys dying. The sad part is they have so many guys they can just keep throwing guys at the war, but they have few supplies. Remember, Russia, a big country. Supplies here take a long time to get to the front. And the only reason it's a sizable force is because they just have a ton of guys. The Russians threw man after man after man into the war. Keep that in mind. The Russian advantage is purely numbers. They just keep throwing guy after guy after guy. But what they do is by keeping the fighting on the Eastern Front going, the Germans have to basically fight on both fronts. This is what's called a two-front war, because they have to fight the French over here, and they've got to fight the Russians over there. So it's a two-front war. It's like having to fight two people at once. The Russians used old-fashioned weapons and old-fashioned tactics. Their only advantage were their numbers, and it basically distracted the Germans from focusing on the Western Front. Again, though Russia had succeeded early in the war by invading Germany and Austria, Germany was able to counterattack. Just they'd been in the Crimean and Russian War, the Russo-Japanese War. Russians were continually short on food, supplies, things like that. In fact, they started having to buy weapons from America. By 1916, Russia war effort was nearly a collapse. We'll spend a lot of time talking about this. Basically, what Germany did was they invented submarines. They put the submarines in the water near Russia, so no food supplies. So there it is under the water. Anything trying to come to Russia, they'd sink. And their only asset in Russia was the population. The only asset the Russians had were people, and they just kept throwing the people at the Germans. Some of their soldiers actually went to war starving because of this blockade. So again, here's Russia. There's a bunch of submarines here. Anything getting shipped in, the Germans are going to sink. The Russians are going to starve. And they're sad because they're starving. Look how skinny they are. All right, we are at about 8 minutes, so we're doing good. What's important about World War I, it becomes total warfare. Complete mobilization. Everybody's fighting in the war. Everybody in your country is going to be involved. People get drafted. Governments are going to take control of their economy. Governments are going to require that industries make them more weapons, make them better make them. And all men went to the fight to fight the war, and all women took over their jobs. So your whole country is committed to this war. You're either fighting, you're dying, or you're a coward. And what happens is you get a new type of war. The generals had fought. Think of wars like the Civil War had been this gentleman's war. I ride my horse up, we look at each other, we shoot each other. World War I marks a very clear difference. World War I is total war. It's mechanized, it's trench, it is dirty, it is nasty. Here are some pictures of trench warfare. So the guys would hide down here. Look at the size of the rats. New weapons used seem to be made more for defense. There are two sides. The land in the middle is no man's land. This is an aerial picture. These are the two sides. Here's the no man's land. This is one side's trenches. This is another side's trenches. And notice they're fighting over this very little piece of land. Good picture of the trenches. I'd say pause it here. Take a second and look. All right? I'll give you another sense. I love the fact that they include the rat. So these guys would look up over, shoot, and the other guys would come and run this way. This war was incredibly bloody because of these trenches. Also, the machine gun. Notice again, and we'll talk about this in class, where these guys' eyes are. They're literally running a machine. Downside of the trench, again, conditions: lice, rat, flooded, disease, decaying flesh. It was horrible. Look at the size of the rats. Alright? And imagine if you kept your foot in water that long, what could happen? A disease called trench foot. We saw that. We're going to talk about some of the new weapons. Technology warfare created a stalemate. No side moved in for periods of time. You see the howitzer. Imagine the devastating ability that gun could have. Both sides started to use airplanes. Airplanes. We also see the use of the Zeppelin. We'll talk about that a little bit more in class. Here you can see this premises were totally destroyed by a Zeppelin raid, which I couldn't imagine being very fast. A new weapon was the tank. As the war went on, they got better and better. Tanks were slow and clumsy, a lot like me. Again, we talked about the machine gun. Guys would go charging up and they'd just get mowed down. Again, look at where everybody's eyes are. They're not looking at who they're shooting, they're looking at their machine. Other thing that was important in this war was barbed wire, because the guys would run into the barbed wire, slow them up, the machine gun would mow them down. Submarines, we talked about that. Germans introduced the U-boat. It proved to be highly effective. And they used unrestricted submarine warfare. Also during this war are chemical attacks. One of the most famous chemicals is a chemical called mustard gas, and that obviously was to devastating effect. Here's some gross pictures. And almost the last thing we're going to talk about, what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder, they called shell shock. Guys had the sense that they constantly hearing the bombs, and this war got incredibly bloody. So Russia mobilized. This is what we started with, and by August 3rd of that year, Germany declared war on France, and it becomes incredibly bloody. Alright guys, that's exactly 12 minutes, so I'm trying to make it stop now. Remember, the funny picture of the day was the Reuben.